Can you see me now? Thank you. Okay, very good. Um, Thank you so much for inviting me. And in particular, I want to thank one of our collaborators, that's Vladimir Komarov of Grata International, who made the introduction for me to present at this summer law school. Um, this, this presentation uh, includes excerpts from a course that I just taught on law and ethics in artificial intelligence, which lasted 3 weeks. And trying to compress it into 1 hour, there's a lot of information, but please don't worry about it if I don't discuss all of the details of each slide, because you can get a copy of this presentation anyway, and you can go back to the details. And this is just an overview, so don't feel uncomfortable if it seems like there is a lot of information here. Just to give a little introduction about what it is in artificial intelligence that we do. Okay. I am putting in the affiliations here in particular because these affiliations involve the applications of artificial intelligence. I am a practicing lawyer and in litigation, involved in health law, commercial law, medical malpractice, personal injury, and product liability. And in relation to the applications of AI, we are also based in Riga in Latvia with the Association of Health Technology and Law. And I am the legal representative to Europe of the ASEAN Law Association. I am professor of medicine at University of California, Los Angeles, and I continue to practice medicine, particularly in cancer medicine and stem cell therapy in Beverly Hills in California at the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. In the areas of science, we do apply artificial intelligence a lot. We have a company that is international, involved in genetic profiling, genetic engineering, and stem cell engineering technologies that really has heavy use of artificial intelligence. I do teach business innovation and data science at the Asian Institute of Management in the Philippines. Talking about interdisciplinary research and education, we have a company called Connect Fields Incorporated, which is involved in integrating knowledge in these different fields. And this is helped by our international collaborations in the US, in Russia, Latvia, Austria, Czech Republic, Poland, China, the Philippines, and other ASEAN countries. This is the basic outline of this overview. The first two sections are the introduction to applications of AI, which is rapidly expanding. Controversial issues in AI, and I'm going to focus particularly in the issues of privacy versus public benefit. And the next two sections involve the ethical and legal frameworks that affect the applications of AI. Citing specific cases, what kind of framework are we able to use to analyze what are the issues that we should address, both from the ethical viewpoint and the legal viewpoint. Just a few high-profile cases involving law and ethics of AI, and finally, the conclusion. But considering the amount of material, let me proceed by talking about the conclusion actually now. Okay. You will see this also at the end of the presentation, but basically there are 4 general conclusions here. One is that law and ethical principles affect the applications of artificial intelligence worldwide. So this is a global issue. Secondly, even though the laws may be domestic or regional, they often have global consequences. 3, companies and data scientists need to be very aware of these laws and ethical principles, particularly because the consequences of violations can be very serious and be very expensive. You just heard from the previous speaker about how it could involve hundreds of millions of dollars or euros. And finally, the field of artificial intelligence is developing and evolving very rapidly. Practically every day, there are new applications, new levels of technologies that are being applied, including the use of supercomputers that we also use in the Asian Institute of Management. And the laws and ethical principles have lagged behind, so they have to keep pace with these developments. Okay. So that's it. I mean, that's the whole presentation. Okay. The rest of this are just details. Now, let me give you an overview of some of the applications of AI. Very extensive, and a lot of these areas we ourselves are involved in. In health, we apply artificial intelligence in the personalization of cancer diagnosis and therapeutics. We do this on a daily basis because we analyze the genetic components of cancers in order to determine what kind of treatment is most likely to work for that particular patient, because there are no 2 patients who are ever the same. So personalization is the key to success in cancer diagnosis and therapeutics. The analysis of disease risks, epidemiology of infectious and non-communicable diseases, drug discovery, and imaging, not only medical total body imaging, but the imaging of cells, tissues, and specific areas of the body, including the use of artificial intelligence in the early diagnosis of retinal diseases and diabetic retinopathy. And we have specialists in our group who are focused in each of these areas. We have board-certified ophthalmologists who are involved in the analysis of retinal diseases. In science, we have a big group of biochemists and molecular biologists involved in the applications of AI in DNA sequencing, protein sequencing, gene expression pathways, in control of gene expression and the simulation of chemical reactions. In engineering, we do get involved in manufacturing robotics, but aside from work that our group does, of course, the applications of AI are very much integrated in autonomous cars, transportation grids, aerospace engineering, and 3D printing. In law, there is increasing applications of AI in drafting contracts, compliance with regional and international laws and regulations, due diligence, client relationships, law enforcement, that's a big area. In business, no need to say, very extensive applications in banking and finance and investments, stock trading, blockchains, e-commerce, automated transactions. And where I am based in Los Angeles, heavy use of artificial intelligence in media and communication, in movie and video production, virtual reality, computer games, online gambling, personalization of content, music production, search and classification. This includes, of course, Netflix, Spotify, and the use of in advertising and real-time streaming. In education, artificial intelligence applied in the personalization of learning experiences, learning automation, learning assessment, and guidance. So with these developments, I mean, this is actually a partial list, but the legal and ethical framework needs to keep pace with the speed of developments in these areas. What are we talking about here in terms of the actual applications of AI? And those of you who are techies, What I am just going to focus on right now is one in the use in epidemiology, such as contact tracing in the era of the COVID epidemic, and secondly, in law enforcement. So what kind of AI techniques are being used? I am just going to focus right now in this center area here, which involves computer vision, natural language processing, and decision networks that involve symbolic and statistical paradigms of AI. They involve the data that is gathered to be able to integrate a lot of this information in perception, reasoning, knowledge, and in planning. Okay. Of course, the applications of AI are much broader than that, but the current applications, particularly in live facial recognition and in law enforcement, is mainly in this black outlined areas that use an integration of different types of AI technologies, the domains and the types of paradigms that are being used. Let's start with the first area, which is involved in epidemiology and the use of artificial intelligence in personal profiling before we go on to the use of artificial intelligence in law enforcement, also involving personal profiling. And in some countries, the use of AI in epidemiology has many links to law enforcement. Several countries have deployed LFR, or live facial recognition, with artificial intelligence integrated into the system. And of course, there are some discomforts being expressed by different groups. In India, for example, the accounts for many of these services, including the use of cell phones and the use of cable, are linked to certain accounts that when it is updated, could be used for contract tracing. Poland itself has also had a biometric smartphone app to be able to identify people who need to be quarantined for 14 days due to the coronavirus. Artificial intelligence, of course, has been used to model the spread of infections. And in medical imaging analysis, artificial intelligence can be used to analyze chest CAT scans to distinguish COVID-19 from community-acquired pneumonia, example from influenza virus, which is very different in its presentation, and voice and breathing pattern analysis for early symptoms of COVID-19, analysis of geographic areas on spread of infection, and predictive models for prospective hotspots. With respect to AI in epidemics, including COVID-19, my own laboratory has used AI to be able to analyze the genetic profile of the COVID virus as it mutates, and to be able to apply this AI system in our design of new diagnostic tests, including the specificity of antibodies to patients who are exposed to COVID-19, and whether this involves protection, because understand that just because antibodies are present, it doesn't mean that it protects the patient from further infection. So the applications of AI have very real and very serious applications and consequences. France has approved the use of Stop COVID, an app to be installed in smartphones, which in quotes is voluntary, to be able to trace people who have tested positive for coronavirus in order to slow the spread of the illness. Many questions were raised about privacy issues, particularly, as you already heard, about the overreaching GDPR in Europe. But as an answer to some of these reservations, it is being promoted that Bluetooth signals are keeping track of anonymous devices, and they are running in the background, and that it exchanged Bluetooth to Bluetooth with other mobile phones, but that this installation is voluntary, and that the Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Initiative indicates that they do not need to use geolocation. They do not need to use your phone number, and no need to use your address. But it indicates still that this could be effective to be able to lessen the transmission of the disease, even though on the other side, some scientists and physicians also question that if it is voluntary and you only have a small minority of the population who enroll in this program, it also limits its efficacy. So this involves a balance of public benefit compared to privacy. China, of course, has been using this technology, including live facial recognition, for quite a while, and heavily used it for trace and tracking of COVID infections. But unlike Europe, GPS and Wi-Fi are activated so that location data is recorded. And I understand in Russia, and you can tell me more about this, that retail payments are being trialed in Russia to test a biometric system for payments, example, at grocery stores, spurred by the concern about the spread of coronavirus through banknotes and payment cards. But again, this area is continuing to evolve in many countries. So the facial recognition process involves mapping faces using key measurements, using nodal points, can capture faces. And of course, Google and Facebook already uses this facial recognition algorithm. In the United States, it is increasingly used in banks and airports. And advanced systems can now distinguish faces in real time in crowds. In China, police officers use this intelligence-enabled glasses that can scan crowds to be able to use it, for example, to try to identify potential evaders who are of the law, among other offenses, and of course also applied to COVID. Now, in Asia, the approach is somewhat different from Europe and the United States. If one looks at the so-called flattening of the curve, where the spread of COVID cases has been blunted, they tend to be countries such as China, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and to a lesser extent, Japan. The technology in personal profiling and artificial intelligence is widely deployed. Even though there are policy questions about data sovereignty and privacy, the issues are less contentious compared to Europe or the United States. And some people think that it may be the culture of being more collectivist, so that there is more compliance in the population for the sake of public health and safety. And the adoption of these needed technologies are, for the most part, mandatory, particularly in China. And the digital infrastructure is enabled and activated by the government. And there is data sharing between the government and business that may may cause some conflicts with privacy protections. So China has employed this facial recognition, artificial intelligence, starting with train stations, in particular during times of heavy traffic. Japan also had planned to use this for the Olympics. The UK has extensive use of CCTV cameras, even though they did issue ethical frameworks to be able to guide the technology. In the US, facial recognition is, as I mentioned, is already increasingly used in banks, in airports, and a lot of it is, of course, directed to law enforcement, but some of the applications are being promoted also for the use of COVID tracing. Now, the numerous applications of AI have a global scope. In particular, the Chinese government is continuing to expand the applications, and the social controls in the use of AI with personal profiling has gathered more support in most Asian countries, China, India, as I mentioned, South Korea, Singapore, more than in Europe or the United States. Some of the controversial issues. Okay. Well, I'm just going to go through the outline. There's, of course, development bias. Technically, in of itself, could already introduce bias. In particular, facial recognition software has been more effective for identifying people in the white population and those who are middle-aged. It has some difficulty, particularly in racial minorities. So the mapping and matching faces have been validated not as well among racial minorities, which raised the concern that the reliability of this facial recognition could lead to more arrests and imprisonment, particularly among Black men and other minority groups. The ethics of use, who will own this facial image data, and how long will it be deployed? What is the time limit for the use, for example, in emergency conditions in the time of the COVID epidemic? Will it be vulnerable to malicious actors? The UK has issued some ethical issues about matching and watch lists, particularly in law enforcement to assist recognition. But there are continuing issues about accuracy, the biased output, ambiguity, and the issues that could affect the live facial recognition involve the data and training of the algorithms. Its efficacy is dependent upon how much data and how much training was entered into the generation of the output, the role of the human intervention, and deployments so-called in the wild, where it is being tested in areas where the population would not have given consent. Data and training, the data set, what data set is being used, the parameters of the data. I already indicated to you that much of the validation was done on white members of the population. Difficulties with racial and gender bias within this facial recognition algorithms, the generation of outputs. Who will receive this information? How will the algorithms themselves be fitted for the particular application? Can it be used for political purposes? The role of human operators, because who are the personnel who will be required to verify or override a potential match that could be subject to error or bias or inaccuracy? I'm just going to go through quickly some of these concerns, that deployments in the wild, issues about consent, and now just quickly into the ethical framework. What we teach in the rules of ethics and artificial intelligence is based upon agreements with different groups about what are the core principles. And for the most part, there is general agreement in different parts of the world about 5 issues as being as constituting the core principles of ethics and artificial intelligence. And that is beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and explicability. Now, the first 4 are very familiar to me because these are the same principles that we use in bioethics in the medical applications of artificial intelligence, or for that matter, for any intervention in medicine. So these core principles in artificial intelligence were actually derived from bioethics in medicine. But what was added is explicability. That is, the AI systems cannot be a black box. They have to be transparent, and they have to be explainable in how and why they reach the conclusions that they do. Okay. So this is in of itself a summary. You can read more of the details on this with some of the references that I indicated, but these are some of the groups that came up with these initiatives on ethics on artificial intelligence, the Asilomar Principles in 2017, the Montreal Declaration, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the European Commission, the UK House of Lords, and Partnership on AI, which is an international effort. And you can see that for the most part, these different groups, including OECD, have identified in some way or another beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and explicability. And a lot of the detailed objections or protections could really be subsumed and organized under these 5 principles. You can read more about these details, that you have to balance what the applications would be of AI. It must be beneficial to humanity for well-being, common good, human dignity, and sustainability. And it cannot harm people. In medicine, this is the primum non nocere, which is first do no harm, but applied into artificial intelligence, in non-maleficence. Of course, these are of particular concerns, particularly the so-called AI arms race with 3 particular groups, which is the United States, China, and Europe, are in this competitive race to try to be ahead in the applications of AI, and could lead to problems in individual protection. Okay. Autonomy, including the ability of the individual to make decisions for himself or herself. Justice, about discrimination in promoting diversity, and all of these are, of course, interacting with the other principles. Explicability, this is what I indicated, that it has to be transparent, and the algorithms themselves have to be explainable. The ethical principles now specifically in personal profiling are very extensive, but could be subsumed under these 5 general principles of public interest, effectiveness, avoidance of bias, impartiality, and deployment. And necessity, proportionality, is it really necessary to achieve these goals? Impartiality, public trust, cost effectiveness. Now, questions are still being raised. So this is a general guideline. If you were going to file a lawsuit against an organization or a government applying personal profiling, what are some of the questions you would ask? Why is it being deployed in this instance? In what way does it really provide societal benefit? Its effectiveness, the accuracy is in question. What are the false positive and false negative rates? And you can read the rest of this, the quality of captured images, and how quickly can the police officers respond, and to be able to override if there are clear errors. The avoidance of bias, impartiality in deployment. How are these deployment sites decided? Who decides? And what is the legal basis for the use of this technology? Does it include children? Proportionality, is the need or the emergency warrant the infringement of privacy rights? And who has oversight? Who will comply this watch list? And public trust, has this been explained to the general public? And has the general public provided input into the applications of this AI? Now, the legal framework is very extensive, but you already had a discussion about the GDPR in Europe. I am going to spend more time talking about the United States. Well, there is no GDPR in the United States. There is no single US privacy law, because they involve several different legal concepts. They involve many federal and state laws and regulations. But when lawsuits are filed, or when there are challenges to the applications of AI, including in personal profiling, there is a checklist that you could go through. One is constitutional protections in the US Constitution. The First Amendment, right to free assembly. Fourth Amendment, to be free of unwarranted search and seizure. 14th Amendment, the due process right. And then we have tort laws on invasion of privacy and right to privacy. There is the Federal Trade Commission Act. There is another federal law, which is the Privacy Act of 1974. But what is different about that is that the Privacy Act, the US Privacy Act of 1974, is really about the rights of individuals, about data gathered by federal government agencies. This act is not a consumer protection act, and it does not involve data security, unlike GDPR. So it is not an overreaching consumer privacy act that you can claim in the US. The Federal Trade Commission Act, however, involves protection of consumers from unfair or deceptive practices. So the deceptive practice is that if a company says, well, we have a data protection policy, and then it turns out that they are not in compliance with their own practice, that would be deceptive practice. In other words, they did not do what they claimed they are able to do. And then there are specific sector federal statutes, including healthcare, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is considered very seriously in all health institutions, but it has to do more with health insurance and in the areas of administrative law, physical security, and technical security. There is the Privacy Law on Financial Services, which is the Federal Graham, Leach, and Bailey Act of 1999 about the right to privacy and the need to share information. And there are specific sector federal statutes for drivers, for video privacy, for cable communications, recording communications law, children's online privacy. And the state laws have some differences. California, for example, has a more extensive consumer data protection, which is different from other states. But many of these state laws cover biometric data, example, facial profiling, medical records, social security numbers, driver's license information, email addresses, library records, your television viewing habits, including which movies in Netflix or what music in Spotify you use, your financial records, obviously, and your tax records cannot just be released by individuals, including your financial score. Now, you already heard about GDPR, and I mentioned the United States does not have the equivalent of the GDPR, even though supposedly it is in process. But you already heard from the previous speaker that even though this is a European Union data protection regulation, it affects companies that are doing work, even if they are based outside of the EU. This includes multinational banks, universities, commercial companies, technological companies that attract you across the web, and technology leaders such as Google, Facebook, and Twitter. If there are European individuals who are involved in their program, the GDPR applies. So domestic or regional laws and regulations have a global reach. I don't really have time to discuss a lot of the cases. Of course, the case law is very extensive, but I'm just going to look at some high-profile cases that drive home the point about how regional and domestic regulations could have a global reach. An Austrian lawyer filed a lawsuit against Facebook about the use of information that Facebook, of course, uses in its profiling, including facial recognition. But the attempted defense was that, well, they were operating in the US, but this safe harbor agreement was struck down, in that under GDPR, if there are European participants in that program, they are still covered by GDPR. And following on this lead, other lawsuits have been filed against Google about and now extending into other groups, including the use of GDPR to be able to help analyze the individuals whose personal information was processed by Cambridge Analytica, where there was a data breach which affected more than 50 million Facebook users. Now, back to my conclusions, and I hope we can have some time for questions. Number one, laws and ethical principles affect the applications of artificial intelligence worldwide. And you already have seen illustrations of how domestic and regional laws often have global consequences. Companies and data scientists need to be very aware of these laws and ethical principles, especially because the consequences of violations can be very serious and very expensive. And as the field of artificial intelligence develops very rapidly, the laws and ethical principles have to keep pace with these developments. One area that is developing rapidly is something that we ourselves are involved in. We are able to use artificial intelligence to be able to use DNA profiling of individuals that identify their risk for diseases and their likelihood of responding to interventions, including drugs and cellular therapies. If you have such a genetic profile, who has the right to access this? Because is it possible for an insurance company to deny your coverage because it says that based on this data, what you have is a pre-existing condition? Now, so the use of genetic profiling is coming into the foreground about privacy rights and also real consequences in terms of maintenance of health and your relationship with companies. Because if you did have that genetic test done and the results were known, it could interfere with your insurability. And does the insurance company have the right to ask you, have you had genetic testing? And if you say no, and later on you are struck down with a very serious disease, the insurance company could deny coverage that you were involved in deceptive practice and hid what were really pre-existing conditions. So this will involve a lot more lawsuits, and but a lot of individuals who do a lot of genetic testing of themselves or their family members and submitting DNA for analysis do have to be aware of the consequences of such testing. Okay. So yeah, you should be able to download my presentation, and my email is there. As we indicated, we are very much interested in developing worldwide collaborations because these types of laws and ethical principles are a worldwide issue, and they will continue to evolve quickly. And it is necessary for us to maintain this interdisciplinary approach, because just understanding the law will not allow us to be able to understand, for example, the medical, scientific, business, media, and educational consequences of these laws and ethical principles. Thank you. So. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope this will be the start of a continuing exchange of information. So we would be happy to participate.